October 23rd, 1959, 11:15 p.m. The Savoy Ballroom. Five men in tailored suits sat down at Bumpy Johnson's corner table without being invited. Each represented one of New York's most powerful crime families. Each carried a gun. Each believed they were about to deliver an ultimatum that would end Bumpy Johnson's reign over Harlem. What happened in the next 12 minutes would force the entire Italian mafia to rewrite their plans for New York City. Because when the champagne arrived, Bumpy didn't pour drinks. He placed 5 keys on the white tablecloth, and suddenly the men who came to threaten him realized they were the ones in danger. To understand what happened that night at the Savoy, you need to understand what Harlem meant in 1959. It wasn't just a neighborhood, it was an empire. The numbers racket alone generated $12 million a year. Every corner had a policy bank, every building had a runner, and every dollar that changed hands went through Bumpy Johnson's organization. For 26 years since he'd eliminated Dutch Schultz's crew, Bumpy had controlled Harlem like a medieval king. But by 1959, the 5 families were getting restless. The Italians had carved up Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Lower Manhattan. Only Harlem remained independent. Only Harlem refused to pay tribute. And that independence was costing them millions. Frank Costello had tried diplomacy in 1955. He'd sent emissaries. Bumpy had sent them back with a polite decline. Vito Genovese had attempted infiltration in 1957. He'd placed spies in Bumpy's organization. 3 of them ended up in the East River. Albert Anastasia had threatened violence in 1958. 2 weeks later, Anastasia was dead in a barbershop, though officially that had nothing to do with Bumpy. By October 1959, patience had run out. The Commission, the ruling body of organized crime, had reached a unanimous decision. Bumpy Johnson needed to choose: submit or die. The meeting was Vincent Gigante's idea. Gigante was Genovese's underboss, a man known for his strategic mind and his ability to plan operations 3 moves ahead. He proposed a simple plan: send 1 representative from each family, sit down with Bumpy in public, make the offer respectfully but firmly. If he accepts, welcome him to the family. If he refuses, kill him at the table. The message would be clear to every black operator in the city: submit or follow Bumpy to the grave. October 23rd, 1959. The Savoy Ballroom was packed that Friday night. 800 people crowded the dance floor. Duke Ellington's orchestra was in the middle of their second set. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, perfume, and the kind of energy that only existed in Harlem on weekend nights. Bumpy Johnson sat at his usual table in the southeast corner, table 47, his back to the wall, clear view of every entrance. He wore a charcoal gray suit with a white pocket square, his trademark fedora resting on the chair beside him. A glass of bourbon sat untouched in front of him. He was reading the Amsterdam news, occasionally glancing up to watch the dancers. At 11:15 p.m., 5 men entered through the main entrance. They moved like soldiers, coordinated, purposeful. Jimmy Breslin from the Lucchese family, a thin man with dead eyes who'd killed 19 people. Sal Tessio from the Gambino crew, built like a boxer, known for his calm demeanor before violence. Tony Bender from the Genovese organization, Vincent Gigante's personal enforcer. Fat Tony Salerno from the Bonanno family, despite his nickname, a man whose reputation was built on precision and fear. And leading them, Johnny Torrio Jr., representing the Colombo interests, son of the legendary Johnny Torrio, who'd mentored Al Capone. They didn't stop to enjoy the music or order drinks. They walked directly to table 47. The crowds parted without realizing why. Some instinct, some survival mechanism, told people to move away from these 5 men. Bumpy looked up from his newspaper as they approached. He folded it carefully, placed it beside his bourbon, and waited. Johnny Torrio Jr. spoke first. His voice was respectful, almost friendly. "Mr. Johnson, mind if we sit?" Bumpy gestured to the empty chairs. "Free country." The 5 men sat down. Bumpy's security, 2 men positioned at nearby tables, tensed. But Bumpy gave the slightest shake of his head. Not yet. The music continued. Dancers swayed to Duke Ellington's saxophone. Life in the Savoy went on as if the most dangerous conversation in New York wasn't happening at table 47. Tony Bender pulled out a gold cigarette case, offered it around the table. Everyone declined. He lit his own, took a slow drag, and smiled. Beautiful place this. Real classy joint. Would be a shame if something happened to it. Bumpy said nothing. Johnny Torrio Jr. leaned forward. We represent certain business interests in the city. You know who we are. You know why we're here. He paused, watching Bumpy's face for any reaction. There was none. The families have been patient, Mr. Johnson. More patient than we've been with anyone else. But patience has limits. Still nothing from Bumpy. Sal Tessio took over. His voice was softer, more reasonable. We're not here to threaten you. We're here to offer you something. Partnership. You keep running Harlem exactly like you do now. We provide protection, legal help, political connections. All we ask for is 20% of the gross, a reasonable tribute for keeping you safe. Bumpy picked up his bourbon, took a small sip, set it down. His movements were slow, deliberate. Protection from what? Jimmy Breslin laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound. Protection from us, obviously. And if I decline your generous offer, Fat Tony Salerno answered, then this becomes a very different conversation. Then we stop being reasonable men trying to do business. Then we become something else entirely. Bumpy nodded thoughtfully. I see. He looked around the table, meeting each man's eyes for exactly 3 seconds. You mind if I order champagne? This seems like a celebration. The 5 men exchanged glances. This wasn't the reaction they'd expected. Johnny Torrio Jr. frowned. Celebration of what? You'll see. Bumpy raised his hand slightly. A waiter appeared immediately. Harold, a man who'd been serving Bumpy for 15 years. Mr. Johnson? Champagne, Harold, the good bottle. Dom Perignon, 6 glasses. Right away, sir. Harold disappeared into the crowd. The 5 Italians sat in uncomfortable silence. This wasn't how ultimatums usually went. Men facing death threats didn't order champagne. They didn't remain calm. They certainly didn't act like they were celebrating. Tony Bender stubbed out his cigarette. You understand what's happening here, right? You understand this isn't a joke? Bumpy smiled. It was the first expression he'd shown all evening. Oh, I understand perfectly. 5 families decided to pay me a visit. 5 families think they can walk into Harlem and make demands. 5 families believe they understand how power works in this neighborhood. His smile disappeared. You don't. Fat Tony Salerno's hand moved toward his waistband. You better watch your tone, boy. I'd keep that hand on the table if I were you. Something in Bumpy's voice made Fat Tony freeze. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was certainty. The kind of certainty that suggested Fat Tony was one wrong move away from a very permanent mistake. Harold returned with the champagne. Dom Perignon, 1952. The bottle worth more than most people made in a month. He set it on the table, along with 6 crystal glasses. Shall I open it, Mr. Johnson? Not yet. Just leave it. Harold retreated. The bottle sat in the center of the table like an elegant bomb. The 5 men stared at it, then at Bumpy, trying to understand what game he was playing. Sal Tessio broke the silence. Mr. Johnson, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We're not here to celebrate. We're here to offer you a choice. Take the deal or face the consequences. There's no third option. Bumpy reached into his jacket. The 5 men tensed, hands moving toward their weapons. But Bumpy didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out 5 small brass keys. He placed them on the white tablecloth, one in front of each man. The keys were old, worn, and each was attached to a small tag with an address written in Bumpy's careful handwriting. Johnny Torrio Jr. picked up the key in front of him, squinted at the tag. The address was in Queens, a warehouse district. He looked up at Bumpy, confusion replacing confidence. What is this? Your warehouse on Skillman Avenue, Bumpy said quietly. The one where you keep the heroin shipments from Turkey. The one you think nobody knows about. Torrio Jr.'s face went pale. Tony Bender grabbed his key. The address was in Brooklyn. His hands started shaking. How did you... Your counterfeit money operation, $2 million in fake bills printed last month. You've been very careful, Tony, but not careful enough. Jimmy Breslin looked at his key like it was a snake. The address was in the Bronx. This is impossible. Your gun warehouse, 40 Thompson submachine guns stolen from the Army base in New Jersey. I have photographs of you unloading them. Would you like to see them? Sal Tessio and Fat Tony Salerno stared at their keys without touching them. They already knew what addresses they'd find. Bumpy leaned back in his chair. You want to know how power works in New York? Real power isn't about how many guns you carry. Real power is about knowing where your enemies sleep, where they hide their money, where they keep their secrets. Real power is having eyes and ears in places you never imagined. The five men sat frozen, afraid to move, afraid to speak. You came here thinking you were delivering an ultimatum, Bumpy continued, but what you were really doing was walking into a trap 20 years in the making. You think because I'm black, because I operate in Harlem, that I'm some kind of small-time criminal you can push around. You think I don't have connections, don't have intelligence, don't have reach. He gestured to the 5 keys. Those addresses represent 15 years of watching, waiting, learning everything about your operations. I know where your money is. I know where your drugs are. I know where your weapons are. More importantly, I know where your families are. Johnny Torrio Jr. found his voice. It came out as a whisper. What do you want? Nothing you weren't already planning to give me. Bumpy smiled again. I want you to leave. I want you to go back to your bosses and tell them exactly what you saw tonight. Tell them Bumpy Johnson has keys to their kingdoms. Tell them he's been watching them longer than they've been watching him. Tell them that Harlem isn't just some neighborhood they can absorb into their empire. Harlem is its own empire, with its own intelligence network, its own power structure, its own rules. He picked up the champagne bottle. But first, let's have that celebration. Bumpy opened the Dom Perignon with a soft pop that somehow seemed louder than a gunshot. He poured 6 glasses, the golden liquid catching the ballroom lights. He raised his glass. To understanding, to respect, to leaving things the way they are. None of the 5 men touched their champagne. Fat Tony Salerno stood up first. His chair scraped against the floor. This isn't over. Yes, it is. Bumpy's voice was calm, final. You're going to pick up those keys, walk out of here, and never come back. You're going to tell the commission that Harlem remains independent. You're going to explain that any further attempts to move into my territory will result in anonymous tips to the FBI about certain warehouses in Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. Tony Bender grabbed his key, shoved it in his pocket. You're making a mistake. You can't threaten all 5 families and expect to survive. I'm not threatening anyone. I'm explaining reality. Bumpy sipped his champagne. You walked in here with guns, thinking that made you dangerous. But I've been carrying something more dangerous than guns for 20 years. Information. And information, gentlemen, is forever. Jimmy Breslin stood up. The commission won't stand for this. The commission will do exactly what smart businessmen do when they realize they've been outplayed. They'll cut their losses and focus on territory they can actually control. Sal Tessio pocketed his key, looked around the ballroom. 800 people still dancing, still laughing, still oblivious to the conversation that had just changed the balance of power in New York City. How long have you been watching us? Since 1944, Bumpy said matter-of-factly. Since the day Lucky Luciano went to prison and you all started fighting over his empire. I knew eventually you'd come for Harlem, so I started preparing. Johnny Torrio Jr. was the last to stand. This won't end here. Yes, it will. Bumpy's voice carried absolute certainty. Because you're smart enough to recognize when you've been beaten, and you've been beaten by a better player playing a longer game. The 5 men walked away from table 47 without another word. They moved through the crowd like ghosts, their earlier confidence replaced by the hollow realization that they'd been outmaneuvered before they'd even entered the building. By the time they reached the exit, word was already spreading through their organizations. Bumpy Johnson had keys to their most secret operations. Bumpy Johnson had been watching them for 15 years. Bumpy Johnson had just made the 5 families an offer they couldn't refuse. The commission met the next morning at a social club in Little Italy. Vincent Gigante sat at the head of the table, listening as Johnny Torrio Jr. recounted the previous night's events. When he finished, the room was silent for 10 minutes. Carlo Gambino spoke first. He has keys to our warehouses, which means he has access, added Frank Costello, which means he's been inside our operations. which means he knows everything, concluded Vito Genovese. Vincent Gigante lit a cigar, took a long drag, blew smoke toward the ceiling. Recommendations? We could go to war, suggested Albert Anastasia. With what? Gambino asked. He knows where we keep our weapons. He could tip off the feds before we even mobilize. We could try to find his sources, offered Costello. After 20 years. Genovese shook his head. If he's been watching us since 1944, his network is deeper than anything we can imagine. Gigante made the decision. We leave Harlem alone. We focus on what we can control. Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, Lower Manhattan. But Harlem belongs to Bumpy Johnson. It was the first time in the history of organized crime that the Italian mafia backed down from a territorial dispute without firing a single shot. Back at the Savoy Ballroom, Bumpy Johnson finished his champagne and picked up his newspaper. The music played on. Dancers swayed to Duke Ellington's orchestra. And in Harlem, life continued exactly as it had before. 5 men in expensive suits learned the difference between carrying power and wielding it. The story of that night spread through the underworld like gospel. Within a week, every operator from Boston to Miami knew what had happened at Table 47. Bumpy Johnson had faced down the 5 families not with guns or threats, but with information and strategy. He'd proven that intelligence could triumph over intimidation, that patience could defeat pressure, that knowing your enemy was more valuable than fearing them. For the next 9 years, until Bumpy's death in 1968, Harlem remained independent territory. The Italian families never made another attempt to absorb it into their empire. They'd learned a lesson that night at the Savoy. Some kings can't be conquered because they've already conquered you, one secret at a time. Bumpy Johnson never spoke publicly about the meeting. He didn't need to. The 5 keys he'd placed on that table said everything that needed to be said. In the game of power, information is the ultimate weapon, and Bumpy Johnson had been collecting ammunition for 20 years.